The laughter started before the tray even made it to the center of the barracks. A rusted cart creaked across the gravel, pushed by a thick-armed American cook with flour still dusting his sleeves. Its metal wheels groaned as they crossed the uneven stone near the mess hall doors. Sitting atop the tray was a pile of long, glistening sausages, thick, browned, and steaming. The scent trailed behind the cart like a flag in the wind, curling into the bunkhouses and making heads turn. The reaction from the German prisoners was instant and explosive. Someone let out a bark. Another clapped and mimed, scratching behind his ears. Laughter echoed off the wooden walls, loud and mocking. "Look at this," barked Corporal Dieter Hoff, stepping forward with his arms stretched wide as if he were welcoming a parade. "Our American hosts have found a new way to insult us. Dog meat, straight from their city streets." More laughter. A few men clutched their stomachs in theatrical disgust, while others fanned the air as if to shield themselves from the smell. One prisoner pinched his nose and whispered, "Must be the tail end of a Boston mutt." The guards didn't stop it. They leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, some grinning. Let the prisoners laugh, they figured. Laughter meant energy, and energy meant they were eating. But behind the noise, behind the exaggerated theatrics, the real truth simmered beneath every joke. Hunger. Not the kind that gnawed once and faded, but the slow, grinding ache that lived behind the ribs and crawled into the throat at night. The kind that dulled pride just enough to make the nose follow a smell without permission. Sergeant Miles Turner, the man behind the tray, kept his head low. He didn't speak as he parked the cart by the stove, turning the crank to lock the wheels. A former Navy mechanic drafted into kitchen duty after a leg injury, he didn't care much for feeding men who had once marched under a swastika. But orders were orders, and this meal, this tray of American sausages, was part of something bigger. The field ration morale trial, they'd called it. Intelligence was watching, and so was the Red Cross. Every plate handed out was a data point. Every bite, a reportable moment. "Dog meat," Hoff shouted again, louder now. He slapped the back of the man beside him and shook his head. "I'd rather eat my boot than this tail of an American street dog." Turner's jaw tensed as he removed the lid from the tray. Steam rolled out like breath from a furnace. The sausages sizzled softly against their metal bed. For a moment, just a moment, the laughter quieted. That smell. It didn't smell like dog. It smelled like meat, rich and seasoned. It smelled like something from before. Hoff was the first to notice the silence. His smirk flickered as the scent reached him too, curling around his senses and dragging memories he hadn't invited. Winters in Berlin, sausage stalls steaming near the tram lines, the hiss of oil, the mustard tang. He turned away sharply. "Just tricks," he muttered, more to himself now. "Tricks and experiments." Turner began serving the food, one portion at a time. No explanation, no jokes. Just tongs, sausage, plate, sausage, plate. Some men took it hesitantly, looking at their food as if it might move. Others stared at the ground, fists clenched behind their backs. Only a few dared to bring it close to their noses, let alone taste it. Hoff watched each of them like a hawk. The guardrail of pride still held firm, for now. "Eat," someone dared him. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The whisper carried. He snapped his head toward Turner. "What's in it?" Turner didn't flinch. "Pork." "Beef." "A little mustard." Hoff stared at him, searching for a crack. When he found none, he looked down at the sausage on his own plate. The skin glistened. A small bubble of juice slid down its curve. He closed his eyes, jaw clenching, and then, slowly, he brought it to his mouth. The first bite was cautious, barely more than a nibble. His teeth sank in with a gentle crunch, and the flavor hit all at once. Salt, fat, smoke, familiarity. His chewing slowed. Eyes still closed, he swallowed hard. When he opened them again, the barracks looked the same, but something inside had shifted. he said quietly, almost too softly for those nearby to hear. "It tastes like home." No one laughed now. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Even the guards, once amused, seemed unsure whether to speak. Hoff didn't look at anyone. He didn't raise his voice again or make another joke. He just stood there, sausage in hand, the scent of it still hanging in the air like a memory too heavy to carry. Miles Turner returned to his tray, recording something in a small notepad behind the stove. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply wrote what he saw. From outside, the cold wind moved against the tin walls of Camp Holden. But inside, in that mess hall filled with men who once wore iron crosses and now wore numbers, something had broken. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but with the softest kind of surrender. A bite. Sometimes the enemy's kindness burns hotter than any weapon. "Is it really dog meat?" Corporal Dieter Hoff asked, squinting at the sizzling link on his tin plate. The question sliced through the air like a bayonet, sharp enough to silence the hum of the kitchen. Miles Turner froze mid-motion, the iron spatula still hovering above the cast-iron griddle. The scent of browning sausage clung to the walls like smoke in a chapel, both inviting and blasphemous in a place like this. Turner set the spatula down and turned, wiping his hands on a stained apron. The German's face was thin, too thin, his cheekbones carved like stone from weeks of bread and watery broth. But his tone carried more mischief than malice, as if trying to laugh his way out of weakness. "They're pork," Turner replied after a long pause, his voice low and even. "And beef. Some mustard. That's all." The men around Hoff chuckled, half skeptical, half hopeful. Someone in the back barked like a dog again, but softer this time. Less insult, more inside joke. Hoff narrowed his eyes, leaning slightly forward on the edge of the bench, his voice dropping as if testing the man in front of him. "Not horse. Not mule. Not even squirrel," Turner said, managing a dry smile. "Just meat." "Nothing strange." A moment passed. Then Hoff laughed, a short barking sound that died almost as soon as it started. He nodded once and stabbed his fork into the sausage. Turner turned back to the grill, pretending not to notice the ripple of murmured approval spreading through the mess hall. The hiss of oil masked his exhale. He flipped another batch onto a tray and moved it toward the serving line, keeping his head down as men reached hungrily, but not desperately. There was a difference now. They weren't laughing at the food. They were eating it. But inside his apron pocket, tucked between a folded blueprint of a rotary engine and a rusted mechanic's wrench he refused to part with, was a notebook. Its pages were filled not with engine diagrams, but observations, meticulous, almost surgical in tone. Notes on posture, tone of voice, eye contact. That day's entry was already half written in his mind. Day 22. Hot dogs again. Germans no longer reject food outright. Hoff asked about ingredients. Reaction. Cautious humor. Follow-up. Full consumption. He scratched at his chin, grease catching under his fingernail, and felt a twinge of guilt creep up behind his ribs. He wasn't a soldier, not in the traditional sense. He hadn't fired a weapon. But these observations were ammunition of a different kind. Silent bullets fired into the minds of men already beaten in other ways. The orders had been clear. Test how different food types affected morale. Identify weaknesses. Look for indicators of shifting loyalty or susceptibility to kindness. Miles hated the entire assignment. He hated the word assignment even more. It made the men he cooked for feel like experiments in a lab, not survivors of war. He stirred the pot with a large wooden spoon, the stew inside thick and glistening. Behind him, the mess hall buzzed now with a strange energy, something between tension and relief. One man, blond and barely 20, even leaned back and hummed a tune that sounded suspiciously like an old American jazz riff. The sound made Turner pause again. He felt like a ghost watching the living from behind glass. Later that afternoon, when the trays had been cleared and the kitchen had emptied, Turner sat alone at a corner table by the back window. The notebook lay open in front of him. He scribbled a line beneath the day's entry, his handwriting jagged from clenched fingers. Morale shifts faster than any gear. He stared at the sentence, reading it twice, then 3 times. It sounded too clean, too clever, but it was the truth, and it stung. A sudden knock at the door jolted him. It was Hoff again, standing with his cap in his hands, dirt smudged beneath his nails. He hesitated before stepping inside. "Forgive the interruption," he said, eyes scanning the kitchen like he'd stepped into enemy territory. Turner nodded slowly, waving him in. "I just wanted to ask," Hoff said, stepping forward, voice quieter now. "The mustard? It reminds me of something from home. My father used to mix it with sausage drippings. He said it brought warmth to the bones." Turner met his eyes, startled by the sudden humanity in the confession. Hoff cleared his throat, embarrassed. "I didn't expect that." "The taste, it's not much," Turner said, "but I guess it's something." The German nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you." For not lying, Turner didn't answer. He waited until the door clicked shut before he leaned over the notebook again, staring at the line he'd just written. He tapped the pencil against the page, then underlined the words twice. Firm, decisive strokes. He could design a carburetor that handled 3,000 RPM under sandstorm pressure. But here, in this place, he couldn't engineer a clear conscience. In the distance, laughter echoed faintly from the barracks. Not mocking this time. Not forced. Turner closed the notebook and pressed it to his chest. You can feed a man's stomach, but his pride will always take longer to digest. The scent of sizzling meat reached Captain Edmund Keller before the kitchen door even opened. He paused just outside the entrance, nostrils flaring slightly as the aroma of grilled sausage wafted through the narrow hallway. The smell was almost offensive in its comfort, a reminder that, even in a prison camp, moments of indulgence existed. Keller adjusted the collar of his tan overcoat, its buttons gleaming faintly under the dim overhead light. He stepped inside without a word. Inside the kitchen, the heat was immediate. It clung to the walls and stung the eyes, fed by open flames, grease-spattered pans, and the constant churn of bodies in motion. At the stove stood Sergeant Miles Turner, sleeves rolled, tongs in hand, his forehead damp with sweat. Behind him, a tray of hot dogs hissed as they browned under the broiler's open flame. Turner turned at the sound of the door, stiffening slightly when he saw the visitor's red armband. "Captain Keller," Turner said with forced politeness, wiping his hands on a stained towel. "Didn't expect you this far down." Keller offered a curt nod, stepping further into the room. His boots clicked softly on the tile floor. "I make it a point to see the entire camp." Not just the parade grounds. Turner gestured toward the grill. "We're serving these today." Hot dogs. Part of a new trial. Morale test, you could say. Keller's gaze didn't shift from the sizzling meat. "You're feeding prisoners sausages as a psychological metric?" There was no sarcasm in the Swiss inspector's tone, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. Turner hesitated, lowering the tongs to the counter. "It's not that simple," he said. "Command wanted to test how food affects prisoner temperament. See if familiarity breeds trust. Or resentment." Keller walked slowly toward the counter, fingers tracing the edge of a clipboard left beside a spice rack. His face remained unreadable, but the silence that followed said more than any question could. Finally, he picked up a stray slice of sausage from a discarded tray and examined it with cold detachment. "Do they know?" he asked, not looking up. "Know what?" Turner replied cautiously. "That they're part of an experiment." Turner's jaw tightened. "No. They think it's just a kind gesture, something different from the usual mush Keller set the sausage down." "And is it?" Turner didn't answer right away. He looked back at the grill where the hot dogs continued to sizzle and spit like firecrackers in oil. Some of them smile when they eat it, he muttered. That has to count for something. The Swiss captain finally turned toward him, his eyes sharp and clinical beneath his wire-rimmed glasses. Or it could mean that hunger is stronger than pride. But make no mistake, humiliation hides best inside kindness. Turner bristled. With respect, sir, that's not what this is. No? Keller's voice didn't rise, but it carried. Then why are you documenting their reactions? Why are there coded entries in your notebook with words like susceptibility, dependency, and control variable? Turner looked away, jaw grinding. The tongs in his hand suddenly felt heavier. Keller stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're a cook, Sergeant, not a scientist. And these men, regardless of what flags they once served, are not test animals. Behind them, a faint laugh echoed from the mess hall, followed by the clatter of trays. The moment passed like a shadow crossing the sun. Keller turned, the tails of his coat swinging as he moved back toward the door. I will include this in my report, he said, though I suspect your superiors will see to its editing. Turner opened his mouth to protest, but stopped himself. The smell of meat still lingered, warm, familiar, deceptive. As Keller reached the hallway, he pulled a small leather journal from his coat and began to write without breaking stride. His handwriting was elegant, even as the words came fast. The experiment blurs hospitality with humiliation. He didn't notice the two intelligence officers waiting outside the kitchen door. They stood silently, one of them holding a sealed envelope addressed to Geneva. It would never leave the base. Keller's report would be intercepted, rewritten, and filed into a cabinet of outcomes already decided. Back inside, the hot dogs were still served. The laughter from the German prisoners, light, confused, grateful, echoed through the barracks like a misplaced melody. None of them knew that the sound had been recorded, filed, and analyzed. Not even Keller. Even compassion becomes dangerous when recorded by a soldier's pen. Otto Weiss froze mid-step when he heard it. He had been walking past the open doorway of the officers' quarters, carrying a stack of dull gray blankets folded over one arm. The corridor was dim, lit only by a few buzzing bulbs overhead, but the words that drifted through the cracked door were bright as fire. Meant to measure trust under comfort, not just appetite. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Rourke, one of the junior officers in charge of overseeing the prisoner welfare program. Otto recognized the clipped American accent, the casual sharpness in his tone. The rest of the sentence blurred beneath the hum of a conversation, but it was enough. Otto stood still, shadows wrapping around his figure like a second uniform. In his other hand, he clutched the small English-German dictionary he always carried, its spine frayed, pages worn, the margins filled with cramped notes and quiet questions. He listened until the voices inside shifted to another topic, something about supply orders and ration schedules. Then he turned and walked away, faster than before. The camp looked different that evening. The sun had dropped low behind the barbed wire fence, casting long lines across the courtyard where a group of German POWs sat around a makeshift bench, laughing over something absurd. Probably another joke about the sausages. Otto didn't join them. He passed by silently, ignoring the whistles and jabs. "Hey, poet," one called. "Don't tell us you're writing love letters to the mustard jar again." The laughter rose behind him, but Otto didn't turn. He walked until he reached the edge of the camp's outer kitchen storage where Sergeant Miles Turner stood over a metal crate, organizing cans of beans. The man looked up at Otto's approach, brushing dust off his apron. "What's on your mind?" Turner asked, not unkindly. His voice held a note of fatigue, like a mechanic who'd been listening to a faulty engine too long. Otto didn't waste time. "I heard one of your officers," he said quietly. "He said these meals aren't about food. He said they're meant to test how much we trust you when we're comfortable." Turner's expression didn't change, but he stopped moving. The tin can in his hand hovered just above the crate. Otto stepped closer. His voice dropped. "Is it true?" For a moment, the silence was louder than any accusation. Then Turner exhaled, slow and rough. "Orders are orders," he muttered, eyes cast down. That answer hit Otto harder than he expected. He looked away, trying to steady his breath. The distant clang of a mess tin dropping in the courtyard rang out like a final verdict. He walked back to his barracks without another word. That night, Otto sat alone on his bunk, flipping through the dictionary he had scribbled in since his first day at Camp Holden. The margins were full of thoughts he couldn't say aloud, reflections, suspicions, a few stray lines of poetry. He flipped to a blank corner near the back and wrote, "Kindness can be a weapon, sharper than cold." He paused. Then, slowly, he crossed out the word weapon and replaced it with trap. The next morning, everything felt different. Otto resumed his role as interpreter, but he no longer translated the jokes. When Sergeant Turner tried to share a story about ketchup being invented in China, Otto relayed only the logistical parts of the conversation. "There is more food today. It is safe. Line up by rank." His fellow prisoners noticed the shift. The laughter quieted. Even Hoff, usually the loudest, squinted at Otto with unease. "You used to make it bearable," Hoff said, half joking. "Now you sound like the guards." Otto didn't answer. Later that week, an American corporal approached him with a cheerful tone and a box of caramel chews, asking him to help explain them to the Germans. Otto looked at the man, then at the box. "No," he said. The corporal blinked. "Why not?" "They don't need more reasons to forget where they are," Otto said plainly. "They're already starting to forget." That evening, Otto walked the perimeter of the fence alone, notebook in hand. He had started writing new entries, ones meant not for reflection, but for warning. If anyone found them, they would read of the quiet pressure building behind every warm gesture, every unexpected kindness. The meals, he now realized, weren't just a distraction. They were a kind of slow disarmament. He thought of his brother back home, who had once said, "Real danger wears a smile." By the end of the week, Otto's role in camp had changed. He was still the translator, but no one trusted his smile anymore, and he didn't offer one. In the final pages of his dictionary, he wrote down the truth he could no longer ignore. "Sometimes words are sharper than barbed wire." The voice came through in static bursts. At first, no one believed it. The rec room's battered Zenith radio sitting crooked on a cracked wooden shelf hadn't picked up anything but American jazz and weather reports for weeks. But that night, something shifted. A gust of wind slammed the barracks window shut, and with it, the dial trembled, caught a new angle. A faint hum rolled in. Then, in fractured syllables, a man's voice in German. Corporal Dieter Hoff froze mid-step. "Wait," he whispered, raising a hand toward the others. "Turn it up." Private Otto Weiss, hunched near the knob, leaned in. The frequency danced. White noise hissed like a rattlesnake, then, suddenly, clarity. "Dresden. Bombings continue through the night. Casualties confirmed." The room fell into a hush, the kind that made sound itself feel like a trespass. Around the metal table, the POWs stopped playing cards. One of them, a young blond boy named Lechner, dropped his hand, 3 queens falling to the floor like dead birds. "Dresden," Lechner's voice cracked. "My uncle lives there." Hoff's jaw tensed. He moved toward the window and pried it open, listening for anything beyond the room, as if the world might confirm what the radio had begun. More words spilled through the speaker, broken and stuttering, reports of firestorms, buildings reduced to ash, train lines cut off, entire neighborhoods gone. Otto translated softly, not needing to add any drama. The facts were enough. The room filled with ghosts that had no names, only guesses, mothers, brothers, wives, children. Behind them, Sergeant Miles Turner stood unnoticed in the doorway. He had come to drop off extra coffee, a rare gesture. But the moment froze him. He watched grown men shrink into their memories, their postures folding in like paper under flame. A few stared at the floor. One covered his ears. He backed out silently and left the coffee untouched. The next morning, Turner returned to the kitchen early. He grilled extra hot dogs, added real mustard, rationed carefully, and arranged each tray with care. When the guards brought the prisoners into the mess hall, Turner was already waiting behind the steam trays, apron tight and sweat beginning to show beneath his collar. "Good morning, boys," he said lightly, trying to offer a smile. "Special portions today." The POWs shuffled in, but their eyes didn't meet his. They moved slower, shoulders hunched. One man whispered something about Dresden to another, who flinched and looked away. Turner swallowed hard. The sausages hissed in the pan behind him, loud and cruel. He served each plate with more force than necessary, guilt and frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had wanted to lift their spirits. Instead, he felt like he was feeding smoke to the ashes of hope. At lunch, barely half the meals were touched. Turner sat at the corner of the kitchen and watched the untouched food cool. He opened his battered notebook and wrote, "We gave them warmth too late." That evening, Hoff stood alone by the eastern fence, staring into the dense tree line where the sun dipped behind the pines. His coat was too thin for the cold, but he didn't seem to notice. Otto found him there, arms crossed tight, boots sunk slightly into the muddy earth. They stood in silence for a while, the only sound the low groan of wind against barbed wire. "They think we are lucky," Hoff said quietly, eyes fixed on the horizon. Otto turned to him. "Who?" "The Americans." "The guards." Even Turner Hoff's voice was steady, but dull, like a note played without rhythm. "They believe because we have beds and hot dogs, we have survived." Otto didn't speak. Hoff's throat moved as he swallowed the words that nearly came next. His hand tightened around the chain-link fence, fingers white from the cold. When he spoke again, it was barely a whisper. "But we are only breathing slower. The smell of food cannot cover the scent of loss." The first blow came without warning. A sharp grunt tore through the warm afternoon air as two prisoners crashed to the ground, wrestling in the mud just outside the camp kitchen. A sausage, half wrapped in wax paper, half bitten, flew from one man's hand and landed near the fire pit. Dirt caked their uniforms. Shouts rose like sparks, sudden and sharp. The other POWs, who had moments ago been cheering and clapping, fell silent as the fight unfolded before them. Turner dropped the spatula and ran forward. "Break it up!" "That's enough," he shouted, pushing through the circle that had quickly formed. One of the men, a thin soldier with sunken cheeks and eyes dark with desperation, had pinned his opponent down and was throwing wild punches, not out of anger, but panic. The other, stockier and younger, clung to the older man's arm with one hand and reached toward the fallen sausage with the other. Turner barreled into them, grabbing both by the collars and yanking them apart with surprising strength. The older prisoner collapsed back, coughing in the dirt. The younger one still reached for the food like it might vanish. Turner stood between them, chest heaving. "Is this what we are now?" he asked. "Animals?" Neither man answered. Around them, the smell of smoke and grilled meat still lingered. The hot dogs Turner had spent hours preparing were cooling in trays on the long wooden table. The celebration had crumbled in seconds. From the back of the crowd, Corporal Dieter Hoff stepped forward slowly. His limp was more noticeable now. He hadn't spoken much in recent weeks. The war's end had hollowed him. There was nothing triumphant in his eyes, only weight. He bent down, picked up the fallen sausage, brushed it gently with the edge of his sleeve, and looked at the two men still kneeling in the dirt. Without a word, Hoff tore the sausage in half. One piece went into the hand of the younger man, still trembling. The other he extended to the older prisoner, whose lip was bleeding and hands were still clenched into fists. Hoff's voice cracked as he spoke. "It's enough." The words didn't echo, but they hung in the air as if time itself paused to listen. No one moved. Then, one by one, the other POWs turned back toward the long table, took their portions quietly, and sat on the low benches or along the fence. There was no more laughter, no more barking jokes or mimicry, only chewing, soft and slow, and the quiet sounds of men trying not to cry. Turner wiped his brow and returned to the grill. He hadn't planned on the moment becoming sacred, but as the final sausages disappeared from the tray, he realized he had run out, not just of meat, but of words. He looked toward the barbed wire fence where the guards now stood with their rifles slung low, relaxed for the first time in months. Beyond the wire, the trees swayed gently, and above them, the sky was wide and indifferent. The war outside had ended, but inside the camp, the ghosts were slower to leave. Later that evening, long after the trays had been cleaned and the sun dipped below the trees, Captain Edmund Keller arrived unannounced. The Swiss inspector moved through the camp with his usual silent detachment. When he reached the kitchen, he paused. Turner was washing utensils in a bucket of cold water, sleeves rolled up, face grimy. "I heard there was an incident," Keller said, his accent clipped and neutral. Turner didn't look up. "It's over." Keller glanced at the spotless tables, then at the prisoners sitting near the fence, still quiet, some leaning back with eyes closed, others clutching the last of their bread. He pulled out his leather-bound ledger and flipped to a fresh page. "What did you serve them?" he asked. Turner's voice was low. "Hot dogs." Keller nodded, wrote for a moment, then closed the book. As he walked away, he paused once more at the edge of the kitchen and turned to observe the camp. The fire pit's embers still glowed faintly. A torn wrapper fluttered past his shoe. He made no further comment. That night, in the privacy of his quarters, Keller opened the ledger again and added a single line beneath his earlier notes. The war ended in a kitchen. Peace began not with treaties, but with the sharing of a single meal. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of culture, humility, and how shared experiences can bridge even the deepest divides. Its purpose is to entertain while reminding viewers that sometimes the simplest things, like food, can reveal our shared humanity.